No? Oh, there we go. All right. Thank you, Ron. It's my pleasure to be here, and I really do appreciate Ron hosting me yesterday and today, taking me all around this wonderful part of the state. He took me to Wash Shore, which I was blown away by the scope of that project, and I think it's a really special place, and this community is excellent. I'm originally from Eugene, and the last time I'd been here was in high school when I came down to play Marshfield and North Bend in tennis on the 4 years that I was on the team. And it's been a pleasure to come back and see it with my adult eyes. Let's see, here we go. The title of my talk is Plastics in the Global Ocean, and that's not working, is it? Let me get it working. Oh, there it goes, just a little bit of a delay. I am an oceanographer, a scientist at the University of Washington, and I'm coming to this talk from a scientific perspective. I'm not an advocate. I try to, keep my advocacy to, let this topic speak for itself is really the way I feel about this. I think there's good science to be done. Like any scientist, I'll tell you that, more work needs to be done. We don't really understand what we have, and I think that's true in this case. But I am an oceanographer first, and I just want to sort of lay out the state of the knowledge on this topic for everybody, for you to make your own decisions. I have some of my own opinions, but I think we'll approach the topic that way. I've spent multiple years of my life in the middle of the ocean. Typically, I go to the mid-ocean ridges, which are in the middle of the ocean. And it wasn't until I got to Sea Education Association, it was a nonprofit out of Massachusetts, that I started to study this topic of plastics, and that's because they have a very long history of studying plastic, or collecting plastics, and I'll get to that. This is sort of the typical scene that you see in the middle of the ocean. Actually, this picture is from the day that we ran into the most plastic I've ever seen in the middle of the ocean. All right, so I just want to contrast this with a lot of the images that you see of the very zoomed-in pictures of the plastic. And the macro picture is that, those environments still look like the middle of nowhere in the middle of the ocean, and you are in a very remote location. I think that there's sort of an imbalance in the way that the public has perceived this topic, partially because of the imagery that's typically associated with it. And I'm not saying that the imagery's wrong, because it's just that zoomed in view. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to step back a little bit and take that macro view. The oceans are just the biggest thing on the planet, right? And it's hard for us as little people to understand the size and the scope, and not only just the spatial extent, but it's got that depth extent that you really have a very hard time fathoming how big and how much energy and how much power and how much life exists in the ocean. And so I think it's that disparity between this viewed in tiny microscopic view of the plastic particles against this huge, immense ocean. And I think that's sort of the balancing act that we're going to try to get through today. Just to bring it home a little bit, my graduation speaker, and I went to South Eugene High School, my graduation speaker was Ken Kesey, and there's one, I'm not making this up, I remember one thing he said was that he traveled as a young adult from, I think it was Oklahoma or that area, to the Pacific. And when he got to the Pacific, it was the largest thing he had ever seen. And that was one of the things that had struck him, was that he had spent his whole life, and he finally got to the Pacific, and it was the largest thing he'd ever seen. And he realized that, there was this huge world out there. To put that in perspective, as an oceanographer, when I get to the coast, what I see is not quite the ocean. It's not the biggest thing I see, because I'm offshore where you really get into it. So this is the coastal ocean, right? I'm into the, much farther offshore. So the ocean's much, much bigger from when you go to the cliffs here and you see this huge sort of endless view of the planet. That is only the very, very edge, the very skin of the ocean, right? So that's the type of scale problem that we're dealing with. So just to move into the plastics world a bit, and I know now I'm just flipped the talk on its head, but that's what we're here to do, is plastic was invented in the 30s, 40s, as a Bakelite was the first sort of product that came out. The Bakelite is a polyethylene. It went through the formation process and the chemistry. The formation chemistry was slightly different from the way it's done now, but it's basically the same thing. It's the simplest polymer that you can have. It's a 2-carbon chain. It's that one up the top. So it's a 2-carbon polymerized, so it's just a massive, massive, massive string of molecules. It wasn't until the 50s that it really got introduced into the culture, and we really started utilizing plastic. And the first reports of plastic in the ocean started coming about in the 1970s. So there's a couple papers published in the mid to late 70s in the Atlantic in Science. It was a big deal when they came out, and then that research sort of fell by the wayside. Then in 1987, it was broached again in the scientific literature, and again that fell by the wayside. And then not until the early 2000s did it start emerging or re-emerging in the public consciousness. And then since then it's really taken hold, and I think there's a much larger perception of this topic, and not just in the, I'd say mostly in the public consciousness. In the oceanographic world, it's still sort of a sideshow. I think we're trying to change that because, I'll show you, I think it's becoming an oceanographic phenomenon that needs to be not just studied because it's plastic in the ocean, but because the ocean is responding to plastic in the ocean. So, just doing a macro view on plastic. Plastic has been engineered to be maybe the most useful product or material that we use in our everyday lives. It's lightweight, it's strong, it's durable, and it's inexpensive. Those properties have in the environment that they're buoyant in seawater, they're difficult to break apart, they're resistant to degradation or biodegradation somewhat, and the inexpensive means that they're disposable in many respects. And so when you put all those together, the engineered properties of plastic lead to them being persistent in the environment, right? Pretty straightforward. So we have plastic, and how does it get to the ocean? This is a sort of a difficult, if we knew exactly how to solve this problem, we'd get rid of it. It's a very difficult problem to tackle, and part of it is because it comes from dispersed sources. And so from land, it's windblown litter today is a good example of that. Sewage outfalls, rivers, waterways, population centers, beach debris, and then there's the marine component. So, dumped off ships purposely, lost off of ships, lost cargo. There's fishing gear that's lost. There's aquaculture. Little plastic pieces are involved in aquaculture quite a bit. So, say for eel farming, farmers have like little pieces of plastic that the young juvenile eels get attached to initially. So these are what I consider your persistent sources. They're ever present in our current world. Then there's the episodic pulses. So today, so this is a picture of the Tohoku earthquake from several years ago in Japan, where massive earthquake tsunami resulted in just incredible amounts of debris being pushed out into the middle of the ocean. You can see a lot of it's woody debris, but there's a lot of plastic mixed in there as well. And so this is what I would consider episodic pulse to the ocean. But it's not just the once every 100-year storm that will get it done. It's days like today where you have just a lot of wind, anything laying by the side of the road, picked up, carried out to sea. And once it's at sea, there's a chance that it'll get washed to the beach, but there's also a chance that it'll make its way out. So once it does hit the sea, then you get into that world of global physics. And ocean physics at the very top level is really pretty simple, and it's driven by two facts. One fact is that the Earth is round and is covered by water primarily, and the second is that it's unequally heated. So hot sun heats the equator primarily, and it's cooled at the poles. That all results in heat moving from the equator to the pole, and that's largely atmospheric circulation. Because it's spinning, that poleward migration of air gets turned and spun downwards, and at about 30 degrees north and south latitudes, it stops going north and goes turns around and starts downwelling onto the surface of the planet. And that's why we get these areas at 30 degrees north and south that are cloudless, typically, low winds, low currents. So the same reason why we go to Bermuda, the same reason why we go to Hawaii to vacation, because it's nice there, is the same reason, ultimately, that plastics accumulate in those same regions. So these areas, also called the doldrums in old parlance, sailor parlance, are areas of low wind and low currents. And what that drives is that when particles that are flowing in the ocean get into these areas, they have a higher statistical probability of staying there than escaping out. So once you have a floating particle, it'll make its way around, and when it gets into these areas with low wind and low currents, it'll stay there longer than it would, maybe drift out. And so these areas are called the gyres, and they accumulate debris. And this has been a phenomenon that's been known for as long as people have been sailing, right? So that there are these areas at Sargasso Sea in the Atlantic is probably the most famous, where there are shipwrecked timbers sailors would encounter shipwrecked timbers in the middle of the ocean in these areas of low wind, low currents. So just to illustrate this and make sure that we're on the right track, a colleague of mine at University of Hawaii, Nikolai Maximenko, has put together a really impressive model of surface drifter data. And so what he's done here is he's taken surface drifters, which are either cards or GPS-tracked devices, and for every pixel in this ocean, there's a statistical probability for that pixel to move one way or another with each time step of that model. And so what he's done here is he's evenly seeded the surface of the ocean with plastic, one piece per pixel, basically. And then he runs this model for 10 years of imaginary time steps and moves these pieces in each direction according to that statistical probability of that pixel. And what you see here is you see the accumulation of these evenly distributed surface debris into these 5 major ocean basin gyres. And so there's 5 major ocean basins. Each of these ocean basins has a gyre or a collection spot. If the world was completely covered with water, we'd see one big strip around the Earth in each hemisphere. So one 30 degrees north, one 30 degrees south. Because there's land masses breaking these strips up, we have 5 ocean basins. And so you get 5 major ocean basin gyres. Right? So this is just model. It's based on real physics from real observations, but in the end, it's just a computer simulation of what he thinks might happen. So what goes on in these ocean gyres? Again, I said they're fairly peaceful in terms of their current speeds are low, pretty low winds, low currents. There's also happens to be pretty low nutrients in there, so they're not the most productive areas of the ocean. And accordingly, they have very low biomass in terms of the amount of standing stock of biology that's there. However, at the same time, they have very high diversity because all of the organisms that live in these places have evolved to form or to exploit the little niches that are available in these low nutrient regimes. So they're very low biomass, high biodiversity regions. They cover millions of square miles in each of the ocean basins. And again, this is one of those things where saying millions of square miles is an easy thing to say. Realizing how big that is much more difficult. Okay? So in each of the ocean basins, these regions are, say, the size of the United States or so. So, as an oceanographer, one of the facets of my career so far has been teaching at the Sea Education Association, which is a private nonprofit run out of Woods Hole, Massachusetts. They operate 2 steel-hulled brigantine-rigged tall ships, and they take undergraduates out to sea for 35 days at a time, far offshore, blue water sailing, and they've been operating in the Atlantic for the past 30 years and the Pacific for about the last 20 or so. Because they have this educational-driven mission, they've been able to get students and equipment and done science far offshore in a way that you would never have been able to do with dedicated research funding to go collect zooplankton and plastics, say, far offshore. The further you get offshore, the more resources you have to put into your ship to get and sustain your ability to sample out there. So these missions where we go offshore for 35 days, if you had a research vessel doing that, that's costing you, in the $500,000 per cruise type regions. These are just processes that happen along with the education of these students. And one of the benefits of this program is the ability to repeat their cruise tracks. So every year they do this sort of the same annual repeated cruise tracks where they leave from Woods Hole, and we're just talking the Atlantic right now. Woods Hole in the summertime, go down to the Caribbean, cruise around the Caribbean, then up to Bermuda, back to the Caribbean, then up to Woods Hole, and repeat 35 years in a row. Same sort of idea in the Pacific, where the boat goes from, say, San Diego to Hawaii, to Tahiti, to Hawaii, to Tahiti, to Hawaii, and then back to the West Coast in the summertime. And so I focus mainly on these cruises that go from Hawaii to the West Coast. And these are all summertime cruises, so there's the seasonality of it, that's a variable that's you can remove just because we're always doing this in the summertime. And so what actually happens on these cruises in the plastic research area? The technique that is currently employed and often employed, and SEA has had the same protocol going for 30 years, so they do it this way, other groups do it slightly differently, but it's all basically the same thing. And if I was to take this method and take a sample and then go back and take another sample in the same spot, there'd be more variability in my taking two samples from that same spot than the two different methods that are doing. And that's called, in the ocean, it's called patchiness. It's just the variability in your sample is going to be high. So we can make repeat measurements and we can do it different ways and we'll get sort of the same variability between samples. So this is called a Neuston tow. The Neuston layer is that layer between the surface of the ocean and the atmosphere, so just the skin of the ocean. And SEA employs a 1 meter wide net that's about a ½ meter tall, and it has a 335 micron mesh on it. So this is typically done, towed the ocean surface for looking at plankton, zooplankton primarily. Over the past 30 years, they've been collecting these samples at noon and midnight every day they're offshore, and they've been recording the results of the tows in terms of the zooplankton, categorizing all the different zooplankton, and also saving and counting all of the pieces of plastic they encounter. So this ability to get offshore and take these measurements has really been, this data set is really absolutely bar none the best data set out there for open ocean plastics collected. The largest, the most extensive, and the longest. Oh, I should say that it's done at 2 knots ship speed for a ½ hour, so you get about a nautical mile of 1 meter width swath of the ocean. So this is a little video. It's a student-driven deployment. So, with using lines, you lower the boom over, and then that's the net strung out on the deck. And basically all you have to do is prep the net and then chuck it over the side and make sure the ship's going 2 knots. And it's done under sail. So 2 knots in a certain sail configuration, the ship just sets up going about 2 knots. And so you wait a ½ an hour, and then you on the ding you pull it back up. And this is in the Atlantic, so there's that seaweed called sargassum, and inevitably, if you're out in the offshore, you're going to get some of this plastic. So that's the technique to get the samples. The hard part is after you get the samples, what you do with them, and especially when you do run into regions that have very high concentrations, because the amount of plastic that you can recover can be difficult to deal with. And SEA has made the decision, because it's a student-driven, project-driven environment, to do all the sample processing on board. Some of their labs and some recent groups have taken samples, archived the whole thing, and then done the analysis back on shore with dissecting microscopes. This way is slightly different. I guess it's faster. You get results quicker. But we've done some comparisons, and you lose about 5% of the total count, especially on that small end of the size spectrum. So basically, some poor soul sits with the sieve sample and separates the gelatinous jelly biomass gunk, as I call it, from the plastic. And these are what the plastic pieces look like out in the middle of the ocean, which is, I think, a lot of, if you've done these beach cleanups, is something similar to that, although I think it's even less familiar than the beach cleanup. Often on the beaches you can say, okay, this is a bottle cap or this is some other object. Most of the time there are these just unidentifiable pieces of plastic that you know are plastic, and it's obvious when you're picking through biomass what's plastic and what's not plastic. But you have no idea where these these pieces of plastic actually came from. This is a zoom in of that, and we've classified the plastic. We try to do a lot of measurements once we get them back on shore, but typically these pieces are less than a centimeter, so in the like 1 to 2 millimeter range is really your typical size piece of plastic, and they weigh much less than 1/10 of a gram, usually between 1/100th and 2/100ths of a gram. And so this was a paper that we published in 2010, taking every single net tow that we've done in the Atlantic over the past, since 1988, and compiling it into a single data set. So this expanded the data set of open ocean plastics, by 100 times with the publishing of this paper. And, so this is every single point plotted. A lot of what I do is mapping and trying to work the data into some statistical spatially significant maps. And this is sort of our end product that we came up with. And what you can see in this picture is that we find plastics exactly where you think they would be, right? Exactly as the models would be if you open your Oceanography 101 textbook, exactly where, that circulation page would tell you they would be, which, is not a surprising result, but is a positive, it reflects well on the modeler's work, it reflects well on the data collection and our QC and our quality controlling efforts. So this picture here, that black streamline with says 2 centimeters per second, inside that running dachshund is what I call it, is the currents are less than 2 centimeters per second, so they're going very slowly within that black line. Outside of it, they're going faster, and so the overlap between this randomly picked, or not totally random. We had a good idea why we picked 2 centimeters a second, but inside that contour line, the plastics get highly concentrated, and that overlaps really well. I think the really other important point to make from this figure is the scale that we're dealing with here, and this is really an important point. If I go back one, you can see that the black stars are all a million or more pieces per square kilometer. That's the units that we ended up choosing. When we do a bunch of averaging and smoothing and flattening of all that data, the really dark reds above 200,000 pieces per square kilometer. What this means is 1 million pieces per square kilometer is 1 piece per square meter. So you can imagine that you have a square meter here and there's one little piece of tiny fragment of plastic. That is 1 million pieces per square kilometer. The most polluted spot that we've ever been in has been 26 million pieces per square kilometer. That was here at about 40 degrees west and 32 degrees north, that green star. But so this just gets at that scale of the ocean and what the actual problem is. In the middle of the ocean, and I've had oceanographers ask me in all seriousness if you can walk on these garbage patches, right? When you're talking about a centimeter-sized piece of plastic every square meter, you're not going to be able to walk very well on that, right? And that's at the very highest levels. As you move away from the centers of the gyres, you get much lower concentrations. But I just want to make it very clear that these are the types of concentrations that we're dealing with. And now, when I say 1 piece per square meter, that seems like not very much. And again, this gets to that trick about the scale of the ocean. When you're looking off the deck of a ship, you can see something like 70 square kilometers, right? So and that is 70 square kilometers on a map is not even a pixel from space, right? So you have to multiply that 1 piece per square meter by just an enormous number, and it starts adding up quickly. And these are the types of games that you have to play so that you can show those pictures of bays just infested with plastic, or you can show the one piece per square meter, and trying to balance those two is really, I think that's a trick that oceanographers really wrestle with on an everyday basis. So this is a picture showing a histogram, latitudinal bins, overlaid on that model. So this model is that video that I showed earlier. That's that base layer, that's the color layer. And this is where we measured all of these pieces of plastic, and it matches really well. So this was a nice result for everybody involved. And then the story gets a little more complicated because the ocean is just a very powerful, very dynamic place. And so this is a sort of a famous cartoon of all of the processes, all of the physical oceanography processes that happen in that, the upper 30 meters, say, this conductive boundary layer or mixed layer. And there's just as you can see here, there's a whole host of very complex physics that go on in that upper ocean. So one time in 2009, I was in the middle of the Pacific, and there was a day like this on the left-hand side where it was glassy, flat calm. And I looked from the deck of the ship, I could see all these white little specks, and they all just popped out all of a sudden. And that was a little bit strange because typically you don't really see all the plastic. You need to tow your net to see if you're in a high concentration, or you can't just tell from the deck of a ship what's going on in the water column. And then the wind picked up to, say, 7, 8 knots, and the little riplets formed on the water, little tiny waves formed, and all of a sudden there was no more plastic on the surface, no more white specks. And this was one of those aha moments that are very fleeting as a scientist that you wish you had more often. But it was a no-brainer that the reason I was not seeing those white pieces of plastic anymore is because that they were no longer at the surface. They had floated up when it was glassy calm, but as soon as the wind kicked up, they had been pushed back down into the water column. And so that kicked off a whole series of experiments that I started doing. I brought in a modeler from the University of Delaware, and we put together a couple papers about the physics of the upper ocean in terms of the plastic concentration. So this is sort of the beginning of that process where I looked at all of the tows in the Pacific, and I drew a line at 15 knots of wind. And you can see to the right of that red line, you hardly can ever get really high concentrations of plastic, whereas to the left of that red line, when you have low winds, you can get really high concentrations. So what that told me immediately was that only under very calm conditions where things float to the surface are you really getting those massive concentrations of plastic. And then at higher wind speeds, even if you towed in that very high region of high concentration region, you wouldn't get as high as you would have otherwise had the winds been less. And so I did some ground truthing of this model using what's called a Tucker trawl, and it's a net that you can send down to the depth that you're interested, closed, and then open it up at that depth and tow it for a certain amount of time, and then close it again. So you're isolating that depth that you're interested in. And so I towed these at 3 meters down, 5 meters down, 10 meters down, 30 meters down, and put together profiles of that data. And so this is what it looked like in a 2010 cruise that I did, where everyth's normalized to the surface. So these are all just say that, between 0 and 1, where the 1 is the surface concentration of plastic. And what's revealing about this slide is that there's a lot of plastic down deep, and actually way more than you'd expect. So when you go down 5 meters, you still see that there's a lot of those points are not at 0, where the traditional method would be you sample at the surface, and that's the plastic concentration there. So we put together a model that sort of tries to explain the physics of it, and we went for a very conservative model, which underpredicts the amount of plastic, but it still is much better than just reporting your measured surface concentrations. So the plot at left is the plot that I showed earlier, and then the plot at right is that same plot reinterpreted with the wind conditions going on. So if you measure 100 pieces in your tow at 20 knots, you'd measure, say, 400 pieces had it been calmer. So this is what these two different plots show. And this has been started to be incorporated into almost everybody's work, because you can't just, in the ocean, you can't just measure one thing and call it the measurement for every condition. You have to take your environmental conditions into account. And again, like I said, we went for the conservative prediction, which underpredicts the amount of plastic that's actually in the water column. If you add much more complex physics, you can get a lot higher concentrations than that full water column. This is called Langmuir circulation, and if you think about when you see wind streaks or windrows forming on a lake or on these streaks of foam, those are due to convergent cells that concentrate foam or debris along these, about 10 degrees off the wind direction. So when you introduce these complex physics, you can get even higher concentrations of plastic, and that's work that we're trying to get out there shortly. We did the same thing in the Pacific. The Atlantic got a lot of attention because it was the first time that any data really had been reported in the Atlantic since the 70s. The Pacific has been known to be this Pacific garbage patch for the past 10 years or so. And this data, again, was revelatory in terms of the amount of data that was out there before we published this paper. There's nothing terribly surprising about this. Again, it overlaps at 30 degrees north. I guess some of the surprises for me is that the high concentrations were much farther east than I might have thought otherwise. So you see those pink areas are closer to the edge of that gyre than the center. And we're just looking at the eastern Pacific here. The scales are slightly higher in the Pacific than the other plots I showed you. And I think there's the Pacific's a bigger place. There is slightly higher concentrations of plastic in the most concentrated areas in the Pacific, but it's not like 10 times more polluted than the Atlantic. The same concentrating effects are happening in both gyres. And again, here's another histogram type plot showing that, again, the concentrations are at 30 degrees north and south. So in addition to the spatial component, that map type component of this, we have in the Atlantic, we have a 25-year history of plastic. And this is where some of these trends get really interesting, in that here is the data plotted within the highest concentration region in the Atlantic over the period 1988 to 2010. And there's no real trend there, is there? And we were pretty surprised by that, especially when you consider that any trend you look at in the plastic industry shows this increase between 100 and 300% over the same time period. So going back here, it seems just pretty noisy plot. I mean, there's sample noise, there's variability in our sampling. But if there was a 300% increase in the amount of plastics going into the ocean, we would be able to pick that up. It would look something like this, and we really don't see that, which was a very surprising result. Just in the last year, that result has been supported by a couple other papers that have just come out or are about to come out. Again, this is looking at solid waste discards. The previous one was discards generation. I mean, any of this data shows basically the same trends. So what does that mean? What does it mean that we're producing, consuming, discarding a lot more plastic, but it's not showing up in the ocean? To me, that means that there's got to be some removal of that plastic from the ocean. And I think there's four possible, and it doesn't have to be one, it can be all four, but just going through them. There's the beach removal component, which I think this community is very familiar with. The beach removal can't account for everything I'm talking about because we've been putting more and more plastic into the ocean and it's been staying flat in the middle of the ocean, right? So unless the beaches are somehow grabbing more and more plastic along with that increase, it's still, say if it was a uniform removal, it'd still be increasing in the middle of the gyre. So you have to have a sink that is removing, and that rate of removal is increasing over the study period. So certainly beach removal is part of the equation, but it can't explain the full. And I don't have the answer to this question either. We're just going through this thought experiment. I have some ideas, and really I think the next one, degradation to smaller particles, is really the most likely. So as I said before, when we tow the surface of the ocean, we're using a net that's between 0.2 and 0.35 millimeters. So a fifth to a third of a millimeter, the mesh size. So if you have particles that are smaller than that, they're getting through the net and they're not being counted. They're not being accounted for, and actually nobody is accounting for them. So if you're breaking down these particles to small particles that you're not measuring, that's certainly a possible sink. Then there's biofouling, so you could maybe increase the density of these particles so they sink out. I don't really think that's a possibility. And anecdotally, we've talked with numerous sediment trap people that operate these sediment traps in the middle of the gyres, and they don't see plastic getting into those sediment traps. So it's a possibility, not terribly likely. And then ingestion, and that is certainly, but again, that would mean fish are eating an increasing amount of plastic, and that is a possibility. But I would put my money on the degradation part. Just as a quick aside, and to show that our data really is tracking these large-scale trends, this is a plot of pellet data from the middle of the gyres. And pellets are these pre-production nurdles, so from the polymer company, when they get extruded, they get chopped up into these either ovoid shapes or cylindrical shapes, and then shipped off to wherever they're going to be turned into a consumable. Those pre-production pellets we keep track of because they're easy to identify in our samples. They're not some sort of fragment. They are this shape that we recognize as a pellet. And we've been keeping track of all those pellets throughout the years, and we see this pretty clearly decreasing trend in the amount of pre-production pellets that we find out in the middle of the gyres. This could be due to, in the late 80s, the polymer industry implemented this Operation Clean Sweep program. And that was a dedicated set of protocols, especially at the transfer points of their transport chain, to minimize the loss into the environment. And they weren't doing this because, they wanted to save the albatross or whatever. They were doing it because every single piece of plastic they lost into the ocean was just pennies going into the bottom of the sea, right? And so the face of it is that we're doing something good. The reason was because they were losing millions of dollars into the ocean every year that didn't have to be. So they took some very specific steps, including cleaning all the docks every day, packetizing or containerizing everything into rain barrels or into containers, and really trying to minimize their losses, especially at those transfer points between, say, the factory and the truck and the truck and the ship and the ship and the truck, and so on and on and on. And so I like to show this because I think that our data is good enough to see these trends, and if we did see, if there was an increased amount of plastic in the gyres, we would be able to see it in this data, and that's why I think this one's important. All right, so this is where a lot of my work is focused in the present day, is looking at the degradation of this plastic marine debris. So what I'm interested in is looking at the chemical signatures and then also characterizing these pieces as we sample them from the marine environment, and then also experimentally determining some of the rates of degradation. A lot is known about plastic degradation, but not in the marine environment. And so the marine environment is unique in that seawater moves things around. It can be very warm in some tropical areas or in the drier regions, and the sun is just unrelenting. The main enemy of plastics is ultraviolet light, and that is the primary mechanism by which these things break down. So this is a geology seminar, and we've hired a geology undergrad to look at these pieces of plastic, and she's done an amazing job at developing a vocabulary using the geologic vocabulary to define these pieces of plastic. So there's striated, there's perthitic, there's waxy. All of these terms that geologists use, we've started applying to these plastics, and we've developed a glossary and then sort of been able to show pictures associated with some of that vocabulary. So we characterize them, and then we also look at them experimentally. We have UV lamps doing accelerated degradation of these things in the laboratory, in seawater, in sand, and in fresh water. What my research does, I look at the chemical spectra using different types of spectroscopy. And if you look at this sample at the bottom here labeled A, you see that there's two very different sort of regimes on this piece of plastic. There's the outer crust on the outside that looks pretty crumbly, and then there's sort of that fresh face. And this is where we're thinking the plastic's going, is that outside edge crumbling away into these very, very fine particles. These very fine particles are still plastic, right? But they're just really, really fine. So, that's my guess at the answer to that sink. Where's this missing sink of plastic in the ocean? So this is what I do. So if you look at the green spectra, that's a new plastic. And then if you look at the plastic from the middle of the ocean, you see these bumps here where I've labeled C-double-O bond and CO bond. And so we look at the growth of those bonds as in the different samples and the different sample regimes. So I just want to show you a little video of one of the toes. This is that toe that we got 26 million pieces on. And I want you to pay attention to a couple things here. One is the size of these pieces of plastic, and it's almost like sand, plastic sand. And then I want you to look when you see the bucket, see the water. And it's not just the obvious particles, it's the water in this bucket is it's waxy, it's cloudy, and I think that cloudiness is all these plastics, right? And so this goes by quick, and really I'm using this also as a transition to the next topic, which is ingestion. So we've caught that bucket in the net, which never happens to catch a bucket in the net. This was a polluted spot, as I said before. So there was a school of fish underneath that bucket, and we caught 2 of those fish inside the bucket, and that was in the fish gut contents, right? So again, this was the most polluted spot that's ever been experienced in the oceans, and there's this community of fish, this environment that surrounds that eddy of plastic and develops its own ecosystem surrounding it. So again, that spot, why that spot was there, this just incredibly concentrated region of plastic, really has to do with probably very complex physics. So the joining of 2 fronts probably, just pushing 2 different areas of the ocean together, sort of pushes these streams of plastic together. That's one possibility. A researcher at University of San Diego looked at sea surface heights from satellite altimetry, and there was this sort of hill just to the south of this plastic, and he developed this model of a streamline showing that dot in the middle of the screen could have been on that streamline. So it worked out in this case, and this might be an outlier, but there's very complex reasons why you get these really high concentrations of plastic in one spot, and then 20 miles away it was back to sort of high but not abnormally high concentrations. So why are these fish eating it? That's the question that I have. A paper came out this year, and the supporting material is coming out shortly, predicting a very large component of all of the ocean plastic actually exists in the stomachs of smaller to medium-sized fish. I'm not sure I'm a huge believer about it. I'm waiting to see their results, but they've put it out there now, and it's for the scientific community to disprove at this point. Well, so here's a picture of what some of these plastic pieces look close up, and you can see that they're covered with this thick mat of biofilms. There's, larvae species on these things. There's a lot of nutrients on those pieces of plastic, and that could be one reason why the fish are going after it. And just as sort of a devil's advocate here, there's an analog between this plastic and natural substrates. For instance, eelgrass, found in shallow coastal environments and lake environments, is a cellulose-based. Cellulose is considered to be a polymer in some circles, and fish cannot digest cellulose, but yet they eat it. And studies have shown that fish eat the same piece of cellulose over and over and over, up to 70 times it passes through fish guts without being digested. Why are they eating that piece of eelgrass, a piece of cellulose that they can't digest? It's because it's covered with nutrients. It has algae and bacteria on it that provide the fish nutrients. So they're eating this eelgrass as a source of nutrients. So could they be doing the same thing with plastic, farming that plastic for the biofilms on it? Certainly. Is it as safe as eelgrass? Probably not, but it has yet to be shown that there's a toxic impact on fish. They could be deriving some sort of natural benefit from it. So I want to put that out there, that there are these other reasons why fish are eating plastic. And I know it shocks me too, but there are reasons why they're doing it, and we just got to make sure that we're covering all our bases when we talk about these things. This is a huge foam block covered with barnacles, crabs. There's guaranteed there's fish underneath there. This is a little reef that's been floating around, and so there are invasive species components to this, and whether or not they're being transported across the Pacific like this tsunami debris, but at least there are species in the middle of the ocean that are coastal species where they're not really supposed to be there. So again, that begs the question, is that good or bad? I don't have that answer, but I know that this is the process that is happening out there. So another project I'm on, we've been looking at the microbial communities associated with those biofilms. So what I did is I took a piece of sargassum, that seaweed that's found in the Atlantic, a piece of polyethylene and a piece of polypropylene from the same sample, and the associated seawater during that tow. And we sequenced it for the genetic code of all the microorganisms on those pieces of substrate or water. And what shown in here is that the communities on each of these different substrates are very different, and they're very different from each other. So for example, polyethylene has a very different community than even polypropylene. So these microorganisms that are focusing on living on these pieces of floating material are very specific to what they want to live on, and they're very different from each other, and the species on natural substrates are very similar to seawater, or there's some overlap. The most overlap is between the natural substrate and seawater. Is there an evolutionary indication there? Maybe. That's not my specialty, but that has been suggested. So here's just some nice scanning electron micrograph pictures of what's on these pieces of plastic, and we see diatoms. We see extracellular material. That's a lot of that that's excreted by microorganisms. That's a pennate diatom. Here, I want you to focus right in the middle of the screen. There's a little gash in the plastic, and we're going to zoom in on that as we get. Right now, that scale bar is 100 microns, so 1/10 of a millimeter is that green scale bar in the corner. And we're going to zoom up much higher than that. So again, now we're zooming in, and you start to see inside that little crack, there are all these round nodules there. It's a possibility that these are bacteria that are living inside this crack, and it's even, there is the possibility that they made that crack. What really has driven this thinking is, if you look at those nodules, you see sort of a ring around them, right? And so they're sort of like coals burrowing down in the snow. And so what we're trying to do now is target these individual cells and see what they're doing. There's no, we're not making any statement about what they're doing to burrow down. They could just be, hydrolyzing the material around it with their attachment points, but they could also be metabolizing it. And I'm working with a natural product chemist at Woods Hole Oceanographic who's looking at organisms like this to see if there are novel products that they're utilizing to, say, degrade or help degrade plastics. So again, the story is not all gloom and doom, depressing material. There is the possibility that the marine environment is incubating something spectacular that we just need to go and discover the enzymes that these guys are using. It's just happened over and over and over in the marine environment. So, there's that possibility, I guess. So that's really close up. That's 2 microns. So I haven't talked a whole lot, and part of it is just my expertise does not lie in the assessment of the impact. But there's obvious the very superficial problems that I think are obvious. Entanglement, ingestion's another one. Organic pollutants, species transport, these biofilms. Bioaccumulation of toxins. Maybe if these pieces of plastic break down to the carbon base, the CO2, they could impact the carbon content of the ocean. These are all environmental impacts that need to be assessed moving to the future. My specialty is observations and defining what's there. The impact is going to take a lot more work because we're just figuring out how big this problem is, what the scope is. I think it's undeniable that this plastic has changed millions of square miles in each of the ocean basins. You can't get beyond that you go to these just gigantic regions, and the ocean has been changed by those pieces of plastic, and it's responding in a way that's very complex and very rapid too, right? Plastics has been around in the ocean for, say, 40 years, and we're seeing microorganisms that are specific to polyethylene, microorganisms that are specific to polypropylene. What are they doing on those? I think those are all very important questions that must be assessed. And so while I can't really tell you to give you the answers, I can say that there's no doubt that we are changing the environment in very important ways in these huge tracts of our planet. So what's the future? Where do I see myself working in this topic as we move forward? Again, as I said in this talk, I think probably multiple times, it's those very small pieces of plastic, those micron-sized plastic that we're not measuring. I think that's where a lot of the research is going. And it's not just the plastic breaking down into these smaller and smaller pieces. We're putting into the environment these very small pieces. So this is cosmetic products that use abrasive materials that are polyethylene primarily. Washing carpets or fleece jackets, I'm not sure how much that happens, but that is a source of very small fibers. And I think there's been very positive things coming out of efforts such as going on in this community to put pressure on the major corporations to change their behavior. So Procter & Gamble was putting abrasives, these polyethylene abrasives, in their toothpaste to scrub your teeth nice and white. Now they're just doing it with chemicals, but they have pledged now to take out all of the abrasives, the plastic abrasives in their cosmetic products over the next several years. I don't know why it takes several years to phase out an ingredient, but that's what they're doing. And that's one, Procter & Gamble is one of the largest consumer manufacturers in the world. So, those are all positive steps, and I think it has come from this groundswell at the grassroots level. But it's not just Procter & Gamble. There's tons of different or companies making these products. So the pressure's got to be put on them, and it's very difficult to detect these particles. So once we have the instrumentation to actually go detect them, I think we'll have a much stronger case. And so some of my goals is to develop that instrumentation, that using some of the techniques I've been using in the lab to go out and be able to detect these very, very small particles. And really what I'd like to do is put them on an autonomous platform, so I can use one of these, what's called a wave glider, and have it go up and down the coast and monitor coastal areas, monitor offshore. In 6 months with one of these, I'd be able to generate as much data as we produced from SEO over 20 years, right? So, and this is available now. I could build one of these in a couple of years with a new instrument built from scratch. So, we're very close to making this happen. The funding situation is a little bit strange at the moment. I think these are ripe for foundation-type space grants, and so that's what I'm pursuing. But this is hopefully in my future, and this is where I'd like to see this going. So, I just want to end by saying, plastic marine debris is undeniably a very large issue in the ocean. assessing its impact, I think, is still up in the air, and certainly it is changing the environment. And there are negatives to that, certainly. It is not the most dire, pressing problem that we have on Earth, but it is a very good one to understand these other processes. And I think that's some of the power in it. First, it gets people interested in the ocean. That's absolutely necessary. But second, it's a tangible way to relate to these human impact driven on the global environment, right? When we talk about a global climate change and we talk about rising temperatures, we're talking several degrees. Several degrees, that means nothing to everybody, right? It's just, that's what happens when the sun goes up in the morning. It raises the temperature several degrees. What's the big deal? When we talk about falling pH, it's half a pH unit. What does that mean, right? 30 ppm increase in CO2 over the last year. Okay, big deal, right? When we talk about, millions of pieces of plastic, that is something that you can understand because you make those decisions to use that plastic every day or not. But it is one of those decisions that you can make multiple. So there is that element of control and that relationship that you can have with this topic. So although the most pressing issues to the ocean are the falling pH and the rising temperatures and the atmospheric CO2, this topic is a really good insight into those same processes, but from a different angle. It is the humans making a huge impact on the environment. And there's no denying that it's happening. It's not like plastics coming from, I don't know, dinosaurs or, it's happened in the past. No, this is us doing this piece of action. And there's also no politics associated with it at this moment, right? Which I think, if you can be on one side of the political spectrum or the other and automatically have a view on global warming because you just deny the other side. It's hard to deny, what's going on in the middle of the ocean here because it's, it's reality. And so, I think this is a great topic to understand the way the Earth works and understand how we're changing it. We do need to come to different solutions on it, and I think that's all part of the process. I think this illustrates really, what I'm trying to say is that this is what we're doing. We're taking all our trash and barging it to the middle of the ocean and leaving it there, right? Is this a solution? Well, that's a solution that we've implemented, right? We've mismanaged our waste in some ways and we're pushing a lot of it into the middle of the ocean. Is it safer than blasting it on nuclear weapons to space? Probably. But we have to admit that we're doing this, right? And that's the first step. And then assessing, what it's doing. But we have to realize that this is the path we've taken, and we are changing our environment in very impactful ways. And we got to figure that out. So if we're okay with doing this, business as usual. But if we're not okay, barges leaving and just dumping the stuff in the middle of the ocean, we got to figure out a better way to do it. I get asked a lot about the cleanup efforts that people are trying to implement. And I think that's every little bit is not going to hurt, but it's not going to make a big impact. The oceans are just too big to make a big impact. And I see these visualizations of these 100-kilometer booms slowly funneling plastic into a recycling plant in the middle of the ocean, and that's fine for those flat, calm days. But those are not the only types of days that are in the middle of the ocean. And 100 kilometers is, again, not a very big part of the ocean. It's a very, very tiny spot. So, we can make targeted efforts and make small changes, but the only way to really clean up this mess is to stop inputting, and then wait 20,000 years, or maybe not that long, but a good chunk of time. And the ocean will do amazing things. It will take care of itself. We just can't keep stressing and stressing and stressing. There will be a breaking point at some point. And so, again, just to summarize, there are millions of square kilometers in each of the ocean basins. Millions of square kilometers is a huge chunk of the planet. And a large fraction of that plastic that we measure is not just at the surface, it's also mixed down tens of meters into what's called this mixed layer. It impacts marine life on many different sizes. Active physical cleanup is not really possible, but if people want to try and garner attention for the problem and come out with recycled products, if their carbon budget's doing pretty well, I think it's not a waste of time. But the solutions will come from our changing behaviors and changing technologies. There exist hundreds of polymers that are biodegradable in water in 5 minutes, right? It's just that they don't cost nothing like polyethylene does, right? And science is catching up with the opportunities, and it's not all doom and gloom. There are opportunities here that hopefully we'll be able to catch and take advantage of. So I want to thank some of my collaborators at NOAA, NSF for providing funding, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation provided me effort on a 2010 cruise, my close colleagues at Sea Education Association, Kara Lavender Law, Tobias Kukulka at University of Delaware, Tracy Minster at Hui, Linda Ammer-Zettler does microbial work at the MBL. And I want to thank you for coming here and treating this topic with the respect it deserves, and this community for having me. It's been a pleasure being here.
So we've got a couple of minutes for a few questions, if anybody has them. Actually, I'm going to catch this one first. And I'd also like to thank all of you for braving the weather and everything else to get here tonight as well.
We're now developing very UV-resistant plastics. Do you see any impact there?
Yeah, I mean, just longer lifetime, right? And some of the additives, I don't know, the famous one, most of the additives are going towards that UV degradation part. And so, yeah, it depends, what you're putting into it and how that is held into the plastic. So longer lifetimes, sure, and persistent in the environment, all that, but the additives can be, increase the toxicity of those as well.
Hi, thank you. Do you ever consider that you're fragmenting the issue of the co-evolving microbes because you're not adding the nuclear, as in the Fukushima and or the military industry of how they're offering to the ocean?
Huh. I have not been following the nuclear component of it. Yeah, and I don't know if that's impacted the plastics and the life on the plastics as well. Yes, sorry.
Another study, although smaller, was done by Algalita in Southern California, which measured the biomagnification of the plastic particles in human body tissue just from fish consumption. I don't know how extensive that was, but it's an additional factor. I wanted to comment, though, on something you said earlier about the politics of this and the need for us to build the type of social movement around this and the combination of global climate change, ocean acidification, et cetera, that was done in the 60s and 70s with civil rights, with women's rights, with the anti-war movement, because those social movements are the ones that get things done. What we do as individuals, like you said, is minuscule compared to the scope of the problem. Not to belittle what individuals do, but this is a social problem and must be dealt with on an international scale. And it's only the young people today, primarily, becoming the ambassadors of the environment, the way that social struggles did that changed this country and the politics of the country, that's what's needed today, because that's the only answer to a society that allows the corporations to blindly dump and create all this waste without any regard for future generations.
Yeah, in some ways I see this topic as sort of a fresh start in some of that. You get away from the politics of global climate change and move on to this topic, which definitely we don't really know the end result of what's happening out in the ocean and the impact that it's having, but that process of changing the Earth through human activity, I think, is the exact same thing. And I think a lot of the denialism on global climate change comes from the fact that, this happened 10,000 years ago. We're not doing it. It's just kind of natural process. And we can move past that on this issue being, it's obvious, right? And so I think that is I think you have some good points, and I see some of these. This topic is doing wonders for the social consciousness of the ocean in the social imagination, and I think that's wonderful. And it's these efforts in these coastal communities all over the country that are promoting that, and promoting the health of the oceans is something that is important to our society. And so I agree. Global climate change is a complex one, and it's massive. It is going to be the defining conflict of the next couple hundred years, right? So that's in my mind, that's the most important environmental issue that we need to face. But if this topic helps along those lines, because the ocean is central to global climate change. As an oceanographer, you realize that the oceans outside of oceanography don't get as much credit for what they're doing for this planet. And and then when you become an oceanographer, you just forget that everybody else has lost that realization. So the amount of carbon stored in the ocean is equal to, it's immense compared to all the biomass on Earth, right? On land.
So we'll take one more question here, and then I know that Giora would be glad to stay around in the lobby. And first, I'd like to thank, we've had a number of groups before the talk out in the lobby with Wash to Shore, with Coos Watershed, South Slough, Surf Riders. Who am I forgetting? Oregon Shores, yeah. Thank you for that, Ron. Anyway, we've got a number of groups out there that'll be there for a little bit after, as well as Giora. If you didn't sign in on the sheets when you came in, please do so as you leave. Also, the rest of the year's lectures are set up as well, so we'll take one more.
Yes, hello. I just wanted to let people know there's a massive online movement at moveon.org, and the ID number is 80854. It's a petition to help recreate a whole new civilization and paradigm that will blow your mind. It's really awesome. So check it out. Thank you.
Okay, one more.
Okay, well, for myself, this is the first time I've seen this kind of data that's very, very simple. In other words, you're just counting particles in there. And as from a scientific point of view, you can look at it as the fact that it's an interim step, just like if you can think about like cholera, when they were making those counts, trying to find out where the situation was coming from. That something like this is very simple, and it just explains everything, and there's nothing left to as far as high mathematics or anything else. You're just counting the particulates in the water and noticing the effect. And I think it's very nice to see that.
Yeah, it's actually pretty funny that you mentioned cholera as your example. When we do the microbial work on these biofilms, the dominant genus that we find on these particles is from the Vibrio, the genus Vibrio, which also includes this category of human pathogens, animal pathogens, including cholera. So that's not to say that those bacteria are pathogenic or anything like that. It's just that they're from there are millions of organisms or species in that, or not millions, but lots and lots of species in that Vibrio genus. So it's just interesting that you brought that up.
Thanks again for joining us this evening. Hang out in the lobby if you have more questions. And if you have any place to post these, I'd be glad to have you be minions. We've got 20 days to the next talk. If you know somebody that'll post them in the window, it'd be great to have you take some. Thank you. And thanks also to the guys in IT.